to something called midpoint. What do you think midpoint means? Middle. So like if I asked you to find the midpoint of, let's say, AB, what do you think it would be? What point? 3, -2, right? Because we go halfway. What's the point that's halfway from A to B? It's this one here, which is 3, -2. So we can say that the midpoint of a line segment is the point halfway between the endpoints of a line segment. Notice it's line segment, not a line. Like if I asked you to find the midpoint of a line, okay, well, you might look at this and think to yourself, okay, well, it's about halfway, so it would be about here. But we can't say that because doesn't a line go on forever? So if a line keeps going on forever and ever, we have no idea where the line ends, which means we have no idea where the midpoint is. So you can only find the midpoint of line segments. And we already found the first one from A to B. Okay. So just sort of by eyeballing it, really, it's 3, -2. What would be the midpoint of CD? Almost.
Or -3,
-3, So this point here, which would be -3. And just like we did with distance, what about a slanted segment? Well, this one you can actually eyeball it. What do you think it would be?
3 and 3.
Yeah. Yeah, that looks about halfway. Okay, so we get 3 and 3. However, those ones are pretty simple. But, and you don't have to write this down, but what if I gave you like that? You could see where the midpoint is. Like you could say, oh yeah, it's about here, but I'm not sure what point that is because it's going to be a fraction x and a fraction y. It's going to be 2 point something and then comma -6 point something. So obviously we can't just look at a graph and eyeball them all. We want a formula, just like we did with distance. And perhaps you can see the formula. Like if I said here, this point is 1, -2. Okay? This point B is 5, -2. Notice how you could find these numbers by using these numbers? How could you find 3 using these? How can you use 1 and 5 to get 3? Remember, it's the halfway point. What number is halfway between 2 and 10? What number is halfway between 2 and 10? Can you get that without counting? Oh, looks like they're going to be waiting a while for this one. Come on, you guys. All right. What number is halfway between 2 and 4? What? 3. What number is halfway between 2 and 6? 4. What number is halfway between 2 and 8?
5.
How'd you get 5?
6, 5.
I know. How'd you get it?
That when you said what's the like the thing, instead of for 6, it should have been 3, but it increased by 1. So it's
Oh, okay. Yeah. Can't you just add the two numbers and divide by 2? What number is halfway between 2 and 10? 2 plus 10 is 12. Divide 2 is 6. What number is halfway between 10 and 50? 10 plus 50 is 60. Divide 2 is 30. Got it. Same idea here if you want to find a halfway number. 1 plus 5 is 6. Divide 2 is 3. -2 plus -2 is -4. And -4 divide 2 is -2. So that's a formula of how we can find the midpoint. So to find the midpoint, or we just call it MP, if you're given 2 endpoints, okay, so given 2 endpoints, and we'll call them just like we did when we found the distance between 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2. I can find the midpoint coordinate by adding the 2 x's together from each endpoint and dividing by 2. I can find the midpoint of the y's by adding the endpoint of the y's together, dividing by 2. And remember, that's a coordinate, so I want to put a comma between it and parentheses around. That is the formula for midpoint. Okay. So let's look at a couple questions. Oh, I should have wrote the formula here. Oh well. I didn't realize I had space in the second page. Okay, so again, because we have a formula, we don't need a graph, right? Which can be, like if I asked you to find the midpoint between these two, it'd be kind of a pain to graph it, plot point A, plot point B, and then see if you can eyeball the midpoint. Much easier when we have a formula. So remember the formula, MP midpoint is adding the 2 x coordinates from each endpoint together, dividing by 2, comma, adding the y points from each point together and dividing by 2. So what would I be adding for the x's? -2 plus 4, and then I'm going to divide by 2. And for the y's, and divide by 2. And simplifying the answer, what is -2 plus 4 divided by 2? 1. And what is -3 plus 6 divided by 2?
2.
Yeah. And remember, you can leave it like that. You can leave it as a fraction. You don't need to change it. If you changed it to 1.5 or 1.5, it's still right. But remember, when we have fractions that we can't divide cleanly, we just leave them as fractions. So that's our final answer. with somebody else or two other people, see if you can figure out the second example before I do it. See if you can figure out the second example. That's the way it's set up. If you guys just add the x's divided by 2 and add the y's divided by 2, you found this point. But that's not this point. So how would you, you're kind of working backwards. Actually, instead of question mark and question mark, the first number in a coordinate we always call x, and the second number we always call y. So what you can do is you make two equations. So imagine it's set up like this. Would you all agree that this plus this divided 2 must equal the midpoint? Isn't that how we use the midpoint formula? We add these two, divide by 2, and we should get this. So -4 plus the other endpoint, which I don't know, so I'm going to call it x, divide by 2 must give me the midpoint x, -1. And let's solve it. It's fraction equation. First thing we do is get rid of the fraction by doing what? How do I get rid of divide 2? You multiply by 2. Which means you got to multiply this time by 2. What does the equation look like after you do that?
-2.
And now finish solving the equation. How do I get x by itself?
Plus x. Plus 4.
Add 4 to both sides. So therefore, x is equal to -2 plus 4, which is 2. So this one is 2. And you do it the same way, except different numbers, to find the missing y. So how do I find the missing y? Well, one of the y endpoints, 5, plus the other y endpoint, which I don't know, which I call y. If I add them together and divide by 2, I'm going to get the midpoint y, which is 3. And then I solve that equation. Again, fraction equation, get rid of the fraction first by timesing 2. Those cancel out. Which means I have to multiply this by 2. What does the equation look like? And therefore, y is equal to 1. So what's the missing endpoint? 2, 1. And it makes sense that you're working backwards. Like if you add and divide 2 to get the midpoint, that means going from the midpoint, you times 2 and then subtract whatever the other endpoint number is. Okay? That's how we find it. We're going in reverse. This is not the only way to do it. Some students figure out other ways to do it, and that's just fine. I'll let you, if you come up with another way, sure, absolutely. Okay.